Hey guys, so I have Sally Norton on with me today. Sally is an expert on all things oxalates and gut health. She has a degree in nutrition from Cornell University and also holds a master's in public health. She also has a book coming out, I believe next year, which I'm hoping she could talk to us a little bit about today. And Sally, welcome and thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you. It's lovely to meet you and maybe your friends and followers too.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sally, before we begin, I just have to ask you this, okay? Say if we could go back in a time machine and you could see yourself 20 years ago, could you ever have imagined yourself being known as the world's most prominent oxalate expert?
Not at all. And 20 years ago, I was struggling with chronic fatigue and all these problems and having, negotiated my job where I was only being paid for 35 hours a week. Because in academia, when you have a full-time job, you work night and day and weekends. So by saying I work a 35-hour week, when shit's happening at 10 at night, I'm like, sorry, guys, I'm clocked out, because otherwise you work all the time. And that wasn't going to go. No, I'm a vegetable nut. I love my vegetables and produce. I had been a vegetarian up until I was, I don't know. Anyway, not at all. You never know where life's going to take you.
Absolutely. So, aside from all your expertise on oxalates, there's a few things I want to get into with you today. Talking a little bit about metabolic health, weight management, gut health, and how that ties into that as well, and maybe even discuss on certain subjects like regenerative agriculture. But I was hoping before we get into all that, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your story and your history with oxalates and your health complications that you've gone through.
Yeah, I've been a health and nutrition geek since I was a little girl. And I suspect it might have been because I was having trouble as a little kid with like strep infections and ear infections. And they took my tonsils out when I was 5. And I hated that. And I did not like being barred from the swimming pool. And I think that made me, and I just love fruits and vegetables a lot. My grandfather loved fruits. Everybody was good at cooking. My mom was a good cook. My mom's parents were great cooks. And we had apple trees and rhubarb and green beans growing out in the backyard and cherry trees. And my sister and I got into gardening when I was about 9 years old. We had our first community garden plot to grow vegetables. And my mom taught me to grow Swiss chard. And I actually loved beets and Swiss chard. My dad loved them. He taught me to put vinegar on them. So I was this weird kid who ate all these healthy foods and grew them and was proud of them. And I didn't have great health. And when I was 12, I started having back pain and fatigue. And I was even like I started gardening again when we moved to the suburbs. And I was determined to put in this garden in May when the weeds were already a foot high and was really being rough on my back. And that's when I started developing back pain and arthritis problems. And I would sometimes wake up in the morning with what was like momentary paralysis. Like it would only last for less than a second, but it was my whole body couldn't move. And it progressed where I went to college. I already had that first semester in school, I was carrying a giant backpack and huffing it around with that determination to get great grades. And my foot started hurting, and that became this long saga. And I had to leave Cornell for foot surgery. And I was supposed to come back when my feet were well, and they weren't really getting well. And my leave of absence ended at 4 years. So I had to go back. And so I went back into now married student housing and was growing my Swiss chard and still swimming a mile almost every day because I needed the oxygen and blood to get into my feet to function. And I was put on, buku ibuprofen for years. Probably over 5 years, I took 3,600 milligrams of ibuprofen, which will destroy your gut and kidneys.
Yeah.
I'm so lucky I have great kidneys that put up with that. But that probably promoted some health problems with the gut. And then I became a vegan after I did finally finish my degree. I had been following vegetarian literature, and then a book came out called Diet for a New America, and it convinced me that all milk and eggs were evil. Very, very moralistic. Like, yo, it's terrible. It's full of pus and all this nasty stuff. Like this real fear mongering, scare stuff, and no real balance about animal nutrition and its value, and agriculture and corporate agriculture, and why this is, there's a lot more fine grain. It's still not being discussed appropriately all these many decades later. Well, going vegan did not help me, and my arthritis got worse. But I did manage by swimming a mile a day. It wasn't really the foot surgery that helped me. It was like I was in a tough situation after school. I was now divorcing my husband and having to work with foot pain. And I didn't have the time and money to be gardening and cooking vegetables. And I think that's why the swimming helped, because I quit growing Swiss chardons, but I didn't have any clue of that. And I continue to have a saga of problems that became, the back never really got better, but eventually I got through the arthritis thing. But going back to meat after all that didn't work, didn't really help me, because I substituted my now allergy to wheat and gluten and beans with sweet potatoes. So it didn't help to add meat into a diet where now I was eating sweet potatoes every day. It wasn't as much Swiss chard, but later on, when I'm trying to figure out worse health problems, I eventually had to quit my career as a grant writer, pulling together public health research projects and pulling together the proposals and submitting them to NIH and so on. And this is very intense work. I did recover my health enough to be able to do long hours and deadlines and pressure and brain work, but eventually I couldn't do it anymore. I mean, I started bleeding with tiny little fibroids. The doctor said, "Oh, that can't be causing it," but it got to the point where I had to leave my job, my back pain and the bleeding and the fatigue. And I was fighting all this brain fog and brain fatigue while writing research, right? Like designing research and making these perfect proposals and fitting them into all the rules. And the rule book for writing a research grant is literally 5 inches thick, especially if you get into center grants. Even did a center grant, which is taking 3 or 4 or 5 major projects and putting them together into one gigantic 300-page proposal. That's the kind of work I was doing with brain fatigue. And I just, when the politics and everything got out of hand, I was like, I can't do this anymore. I need a hysterectomy. Weirdly, a health nut who needs a hysterectomy, who can't sit in her chair and who can barely think. And I had this hysterectomy, and not before I didn't spend a few days stuck in the bathroom bleeding so badly I couldn't leave the bathroom. And it was not good. And then after the surgery, I couldn't function at all. I couldn't read anymore. I couldn't really exercise. I had no tolerance for exercise. A small workout would make me fatigued for 5 days. And so I went on a 3-year saga quest, like, what's wrong with me? And my endocrinologist sent me to the sleep doctor, who found my brain was waking up 29 times an hour.
Wow.
So that explains why you can't do anything. You can't read anymore. No wonder I had so much brain fatigue, because the brain was never rested. And so that was a 3-year saga to find out, what's causing brain toxicity. Sleep problems mean your brain has got a toxicity problem and probably an inflammation problem, because they go together. And the literature suggests it's from gut dysbiosis. So I thought, I got to fix my SIBO. I took the SIBO drugs. I got tested for it. The test was like, well, you don't really have SIBO, but I treated it anyway because I was desperate. And none of that. And so in the process, I figured out this oxalate thing, which completely shocked me. I realized in 2009 that I had like this vulva pain issue briefly. And I learned about the Vulva Pain Foundation and pelvic pain and genital pain. And somehow oxalates are connected with that. It made no sense. I didn't learn any of that in school. I was like, there wasn't enough science in that for me to get the logical me satisfied that that worked. But I now was learning about oxalate. And so during the saga of trying to recover from total disability, I recognized oxalate was connected to my arthritis. In my 20s, it was horrible. The arthritis was so bad. I was like, crap, you mean I went through all that pain and disability because of healthy vegetables? I was just like weirded out by that. And I'm like, and then I was resentful that I had to even do this diet because I have this SIBO problem and I have this sleep problem. And now I have to fix my arthritis. And I thought they were all separate problems. Well, actually properly doing a low oxalate diet taught me that they were all the same problem. I was overloaded with a lifetime of overeating high oxalate vegetables and had damaged my health severely at every level.
So, okay, so that's interesting. So I think a lot of people only associate oxalates with kidney stones. Like every doctor I've been to, everyone that I know say, oh, I don't have a problem with oxalates. I don't have any kidney stones. So can you tell me like what sort of, health conditions or diseases are most linked with oxalates or high oxalate consumption?
Yes, and kidney stones would be the number one thing. And I hope we can come back to kidney health and explain why science and medicine is confused even about oxalate and the connection with kidney stones. So essentially what's happening with kidney stones is oxalic acid that's in the Swiss chard and sweet potatoes and kiwis and celery that I loved. That oxalic acid gets into the bloodstream by a lot, like 15% is considered normal. And if you have gut health issues, or if you've had bariatric surgery, you can, or for other reasons, they don't even see gut health issues, and they'll still find some people are absorbing like 60 or more percent of oxalic acid. That's a huge leap. You're absorbing 5 times more. That's like eating a diet 5, 6, 10 times more than the quote average diet. And of course, how we define average is a whole nother topic that's a problem, because we think we're all just eating within our tolerance level, when if you're doing the healthy eating that's being suggested now using sweet potatoes and foods like spinach and Swiss chard, you could be easily eating 10 times your tolerance level. Well, a lot of us have kidneys that tolerate even 10 times the oxalate level. That doesn't mean that the oxalic acid that's getting into your blood and your critical organs, because everything that goes from your intestines into your blood goes straight to the liver and then to the heart and the lungs and then into general circulation. And the kidneys then can take it out. That's their job. So you eat oxalic acid, it gets in your blood, then the kidneys eventually take it out. But first it takes a tour of your whole body, and it's toxic. And one of the things it does is it grabs calcium and magnesium and iron, but primarily calcium. And calcium, oxalic acid comes into the kidneys and calcium oxalate as well. And it can start crystallizing in the little tubules that are forming urine. And normally a healthy kidney has 3 or 4 mechanisms for preventing that from becoming a stone. It's just that some people, those mechanisms aren't working very well. And that's probably only 12 or 15% of the population. The rest of us have all these amazing redundant systems for preventing calcium oxalate from becoming stones. So it's only a subset of the population that gets the kidney stones. The rest of us get vascular inflammation. We wear out our livers with all that oxalic acid coming in is toxic enough to the cells that the cells have to use a lot of glutathione and internal antioxidant powers that cells naturally have and make to protect themselves. And you can really kind of wear out your liver's ability to protect you from other toxins because you're overexposing the liver to this particular toxin. And we're all eating food every day. Of all the toxins, something in food that we eat every day is the most prominent in your body, but we don't even think about that plants inherently have these toxins. So the other symptoms can include chemical sensitivity because you're wearing out your liver, or intolerance to alcohol, or various vascular problems, or even arrhythmias. But typically there's like 3 categories of symptoms, or maybe 4. There's the urinary tract. So there's not just kidney stones, but there's inflammation in the urinary tract that includes interstitial cystitis, pelvic inflammation. Interstitial cystitis is basically inflamed, irritable bladder that's complaining and needs to pee a lot and makes you get up at night and can be quite uncomfortable and very disruptive in your life. You can barely take a long drive to go somewhere. You got to know where all the bathrooms are and stop every chance you get because you never know. And it can even lead to leaking and incontinence and just problems with the whole urinary tract. But then you've got the gut, because you're eating oxalic acid is a corrosive acid that you can use to clean rust out of an engine. They use it in industry and have been using it in industry since the 1700s as a bleaching agent. It's in household cleaners because it can grab the rust off your patio and clean you. If your patio furniture has rusted your patio, get some oxalic acid, maybe some spinach juice, and you can clean it that way. Well, you're cleaning out it's very hard on the cells of the gut. And also oxalic acid is forming calcium crystals. Plants deliberately build crystals for lots of metabolic reasons. And for us, it's like eating really microscopic, invisible shards of glass. So those shards of glass is like eating sandpaper. So sandpaper plus acid is a bad combination for your gut in the long run. It also overwhelms the bacteria in the gut and can kill off the very bacteria that would otherwise consume the oxalate and help you manage your over oxalate. You can literally eat so much oxalate that you kill your defense system off in your colon.
Wow.
So gut problems are pretty universal. Like I would say 60% of everyone with an oxalate problem has some degree of IBS or constipation or diarrhea or inflammation or belching problems. So gut issues and dysbiosis, candida, pelvic candida, gut candida. But, if you're using a lot of monostat for your yeast infections, you're a candidate. If you keep thinking you're getting UTIs, that's like bladder infections, could be just inflammation from the interstitial cystitis, or it could be this dysbiosis that's making it hard for your natural flora to protect you from overgrowth of candida, and also making it harder for your immune system to manage the population in the colon and in the body. Normally, the immune system is sort of either cultivating and trimming and weeding, constantly weeding out stuff that it doesn't want growing there. So think of the gut as a gardener. The immune system that lives in the gut is a gardener that works on the ecosystem of your body that allows you to not get infections. But when oxalate's around, you're changing the terrain, you're creating acidity, you're creating nutrient deficiencies, especially with the minerals, because it grabs minerals. Remember the patio chairs? Well, you're sucking minerals out of your body from the inflammation, from the direct chelation of oxalic acid grabbing minerals. And all of that makes it very hard for your immune system to be a healthy gardener. And so you're prone to these infections. And once you're toxic with oxalate, where you're eating it all the time, it starts building up in the tissue. So it's creating acidity in the process. It's creating mineral deficiencies, probably B vitamin deficiencies as well. And also because we're eating at a level that's beyond what the kidneys really can manage, it's accumulating in the tissues. So then you've got this chronic problem where the toxin you're eating that's disrupting your ecosystem of your body is hanging around in your tissues now in a nano form that's completely invisible. And science hasn't been paying attention to nanocrystals of oxalate at all. And then the body will sometimes collect the nasty, very toxic nanoparticles of calcium oxalate and let them build up into microcrystals and encase them and try to make them less toxic. And sometimes they'll find these microcrystals and you'll see them in breast biopsies, you'll see them in breast scans. They're very commonly happening in thyroid glands. And it tends to go towards the bones. The excess oxalate that's backing up in our body eventually ends up in the bones, tissues, and joints, and is related to arthritis, osteoporosis, connective tissue problems, poor recovery from injury. It's also, oxalic acid is interfering with enzyme function. So the cells become inflamed. They are damaged. The mitochondria get damaged. There's also an enzyme interference problem with a little tiny oxalic acid molecule is sitting on at least 4 enzymes that produce cell energy. And then an enzyme, one of those 4 is the one that lets you produce glucose. So when you're not eating, your body produces glucose in order to keep your blood sugar at the right level. But if you're eating a lot of oxalate, you have problems with glucose, you have problems with cell energy. The cell energy problem creates tissue maintenance problems because you need to reproduce your cells. But if you don't have enough energy and you don't have enough nutrients, the cell replication rate slows down. And then the body has to allow fibroblasts to make fibrotic collagen tissue to hold you together. So the body starts producing glue, which is scar tissue, to hold all your tissues together. So you don't notice that you're not maintaining your tissues, except if you hurt your feet in college and never recover until 30 years later, you go on a low oxalate diet and finally your feet work for the first time in adulthood.
Yeah, that's amazing. I actually saw a study recently as well, just touching on the breast tissue comment that you just said, that that they're also linked with breast cancer potentially.
Yeah, that study suggested that they demonstrated that exposure to oxalic acid turns cells cancerous in the breast tissue.
Right, and I also saw another study linking to autism that was, I think, conducted in part with Susan Owens as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because she really had an innovative idea working with the autistic folks, that there was a connection, and she followed the same testing that was done for the Vulva Pain Foundation and had these urine tests where each void of urine was tested in, I think, 9 children. Mm-hmm. And they found the same pathologic spikes where some of the voids during the day, 1 to 3 out of, say, 8, would be super elevated. And that's the same pattern that Clive noticed with the vulva pain or the pelvic pain and genital pain women that he studied. He studied nearly 4,000. So she piggybacked on that. And it was the families who said, well, wait a minute, if oxalate's high, shouldn't we avoid eating it? And so they started doing this with the children, and remarkable things happened there, both good and bizarre, that opened up a whole way of thinking about this that was new. And Susan was brilliant to say, oh my gosh, there's this phenomenon of the body clearing out the oxalates again that she calls dumping. And so everybody calls this process of all this accumulated oxalate now trying to come out, and the way the body's trying to manage that is dumping, which dumping means the body's trying to move too much at one time, and it causes symptoms that are very weird and toxic. And with the children, rashes would pop out and weird behaviors, and they would get more tics and tremors and be more emotional and hard to work with during these times of this clearing episodes.
Well, I can tell you my first foray into oxalates, which I didn't know at the time. I've been living with chronic pelvic pain syndrome now for about 23 years, since I was 18 years old. And when I saw my doctor, he said that, I was too young to have that condition. That's for old men. And so he thought it was a bacterial infection. So he loaded me up with a bunch of antibiotics. And I took many courses of very potent antibiotics for years, actually. And it got to be so bad that, the pain was so bad that they actually put me on a benzodiazepine. And that sort of set me on a course on the road to hell, to be honest. And I've dealt with all kinds of gut health issues for many years. So SIBO, Candida, I have methane SIBO, just terrible leaky gut, and all of the millions of symptoms that go along with that, the brain fog and vision issues and rashes and kidney stones and restless leg syndrome. And I could just go on about my symptoms all day, but
sounds like oxalate poisoning to me.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. So I've had tons of kidney stones. I've probably had at least, I would say, 40 kidney stones over the years. I've passed many. I actually just passed one last month. It's probably the most painful kidney stone I've ever passed in my life. So a lot of problems there, especially with oxalates. Even right now, I'm going through a period of oxalate dumping because I've cut them out with my diet. So, with my business, I see tons of clients with really poor gut health. And I'm seeing this growing trend. Their doctors label them with IBS, which I like, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't really know what IBS means, but it's like almost as if, their bowels just woke up on the wrong side of the bed one day. So they're diagnosed with IBS. They think that they have
At
this
least they
condition.
now believe in IBS. Before it was considered like a nut job thing.
Right, which is
back when I got it.
yeah, which SIBO and Candida, even though there's plenty of research coming out from Johns Hopkins and Yale and other prestigious institutions that back up SIBO and Candida overgrowth. But I think in the general medical community, it's still sort of seen as quackery, and they don't believe in it. So I think there's a lot of misinformation out there as to regarding what IBS is exactly. And I'm having a lot of my clients personally turning away from more of a ancestral traditional diet, more towards a plant-based diet. So let me just I was thinking, let me just walk you through a scenario, and you could tell me maybe what's wrong with this. Maybe for someone both with leaky gut and digestive problems, and for someone who has an intact gut. Okay, so I'll sort of run you through my diet maybe 10 years ago. Okay, so I'd wake up in the morning. I love to have my spinach smoothie. So I'd have a couple of cups of spinach, maybe throw some fruit juice in there as well. I'd have some
what? Throw what in?
What's that?
Spinach plus what?
Oh, just some maybe some fruit juice or something,
Fruit
like
juice.
some pineapple or something like that.
You got to sweeten up that spinach. Yeah.
You guys.
It's a little tart, right? Why would it be tart if it's full of oxalic acid?
Yeah. And maybe I'd have some almond flour pancakes and wash that down with my spinach smoothie. For snacks, maybe I'd have some dark chocolate covered almonds. For lunch, I would have maybe sweet potato with some kind of meat. And then for dinner, I would, again, maybe I'd have some kind of grain, like quinoa or something like that with some kind of meat. So can you walk me through? So these are all, known to be very healthy foods, right? So can you walk me through what is wrong with that scenario, both for someone with digestive problems and for someone that doesn't, maybe they have perfectly intact guts? And is that something that they should be worried about, that kind of diet, if they don't seem to have any gut health issues?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. At least I don't hear slow cooked beans in there, because if you slow cook your beans, the lectins are preserved. This is another toxin that plants make for their seeds, especially, that wrecks the gut. So I think that was my gateway, even though I too was put on lots of painkillers and antibiotics. The real thing that I think really pushed me over the edge and wrecked my gut was slow cooking beans. I didn't hear that in yours, but I think almonds are the most toxic food going. Almond flour pancakes, it's not sprouted, it's not, little baby almond trees, no, it's a product that the tree makes to make sure that nobody wants to eat it and nobody can digest it, because it's the baby of the tree. And there's something about almonds, the oxalic acid in them is very bioavailable, meaning it can move easily from the gut into the bloodstream. And there's got to be a bunch of other things in almonds that are just wrecking the gut. Almond flour is a great way to produce oxalate toxicity. And I think it's because it has the double punch of the other chemicals in there are helping oxalic acid and oxalate crystals wreck your gut. And so it's like, I really found when I spent a whole year reading the literature about lectins and all these other plant anti-nutrients, we call them, and people think, oh, anti-nutrients. No, there's chemicals in plants that defend plants that are inherently and intentionally toxic. And it seems like the main mechanism of toxicity is to wreck your gut. So if you really want your interface of your inner world and the outer world protected, that's what the gut is. The gut is the inside of the gut where your food is still like considered the outside world. The gut's job, with one little layer of cells and some mucus, is to keep the outer world from harming the inner world. And you're wrecking that with almond flour, with spinach smoothies, with sweet potatoes, quinoa, teff, buckwheat. These foods are being promoted as the great saviors and the direction to go. And I think the belief in that is because the low fat message created such a huge problem with metabolic syndrome, diabetes, and obesity that we're desperate to have people not be fat and have diabetes. And eating plants is a great way to interrupt your ability to use nutrients. There's polyphenols in there that that interfere with enzymes that digest the calorie bearing nutrients. So your macronutrient digestion is interfered with. Fiber interferes with digestion. So eating a high plant diet is a little bit like getting bariatric surgery, and that it's going to create a bit of a malabsorption / deficiency process where it's easier to be thin for a lot of people, not everyone, but it looks like the answer. Like, give them indigestible fiber and plants and they won't be fat anymore and they won't have diabetes. Like, this is some kind of weird desperation move versus a thoughtful reflection on corporate processed food versus ancestral eating, where we're literally hunting as our primary source of food and calories and nutrients.
Yeah. So I want to get in. So there's so many different subjects I want to get into, dumping and so on, but I just want to touch base a little further on what you just said. So where do you think this sort of vilification of meat and saturated fat and all that stuff, where and cholesterol, where's that all come from? And what are maybe, is there any validity to it? Are there any health benefits to eating more meat and saturated fat? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so that's a really huge topic that could be like 3 hours of discussion, like the history of
maybe for another day. Yeah.
I'm afraid of meat. If we were hunter gatherers for like 2 million years and hunting was the thing that made us human, actually, like, okay, so if you don't believe in evolution, excuse me, but this is where science is. We change over time. And if our predecessors were not as tall and smart and have a big brain as us, it was really the diet, the development of hunting technologies, of scavenging, of beating up other animals and taking away their hunt. Like in my yard, the hawk gets the rabbit and then the crows chase off the hawk. We used to be the crows, the mob of crows that would take off the lion's catch and steal their food. As we learned to eat animal foods and animal organs and high fat and blood and so on, we grew big brains. And then we lived on hunted food for millions of years. And now we think it was the philosophy of really, I think, the sort of Renaissance and the dawn of rights of man thinking among philosophers saying, we shouldn't have all this hierarchy, this medieval, like the peon caste versus the ruling caste. We should have a flatter society that treats all humans as having equal value and equal rights and fairness and all this stuff. So that was really the beginning of that philosophy that led to the American and French Revolution. This is, the king shouldn't suppress us and take all our money and keep us down, where in order to be a more moral person, you weren't going to kill others, you weren't going to eat them. And so we started overthinking diet as a moral act rather than as a biological ecosystem act. But we're put in the planet and ecosystem in this place of sort of thinning the ruminant herd and moving around and finding where there's lots of animals, where that's an easy catch, where there's room to thin the herd or thin the school of fish, right? And so we weren't thinking in terms of our ecological, we didn't really have any ecological conscience then, I don't think. I mean, we had lost track of our inherent connection with nature that was happening during hunting gathering eras that started to change as we built city life and built social structures to manage our ecology by creating rules. Like in certain parts of the world, you can't eat a lot of beef or pork because when you have concentrated city populations, you will wreck the environment. And so there's a lot of religion that have built up around, oh, meat could be bad, is part of making city life work ecologically. So there's a lot of layers to this, but it got picked up, especially in America, Graham, the guy who was named for the graham cracker, was trying to live on bran, and there was many preachers and things worrying about alcoholism and preaching temperance and preaching, sexual purity and piety. And so they really felt that if you didn't eat meat, you wouldn't be such a ravenous, angry, abusive man, like we would, and you wouldn't want to have sex with everything that walked by. Like we could, kind of cut off your balls, so to speak, with diet. And it sort of works. I think that's why vegetarian diets are used in monasteries, to sort of cut back sexual energies. So, and then it was that religious class that became prominent in the development of like Kellogg's and development of the breakfast cereal. And Harvey Kellogg was very influential, and it had was teaching people, had a nursing school, medical school. It's like teaching his vegetarian philosophy to people who were going to be in the health field. And one of those people founded the dietetics, the whole nutrition profession. It started with vegans. And it's just been carried on from there. This idea that you can be more moral by not eating your inherent diet has been leading us in a wrong direction. It continues to go bad. And then I don't know what Ansel Keys was doing what his real goal was. Some people say it's because he wanted to make money on these new fake fats, the sort of Crisco.
Yeah.
And he was invested in the vegetable oils and converting people from butter to Crisco.
Right.
So there's money in the 19th century, really in the 20th century, especially the sort of post-industrialization era, really skewed science a lot. And even in medicine got skewed because they needed to capitalize and become a sort of a monopoly in healthcare and get rid of the chiropractors and other competing professions that were around and codify what they do. And in order to be really expert, they needed to go more sciencey and more testy and this kind of thing, and got away from the art of medicine, which is listening to symptoms, understanding how the body works, and thinking about how you can manipulate the environment and lifestyle of your patient to make them better. That's what medicine used to do. But when we moved to this kind of monopolistic system, we had to stick with testing and special agents and things like surgery. There's a very high barrier to being good at surgery. You want to pick a good surgeon who's well-trained, so we get the best trained people. So there was a kind of a business model there for the whole medical field that is really playing out today, where pharma and devices and surgery have taken over the options we have in healthcare now.
It's amazing how they kind of profit on every aspect of that. So, I kind of feel like I've kind of woken up a little bit from the matrix in the last year or so, because I've gone down a lot of rabbit holes in terms of researching who owns our food, who's producing the chemicals for our food, the funding for nutrition science, the narrative around that. And it all ties back to the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, they bought up all these companies, Monsanto, Syngenta, DuPont, a bunch of other ones that own all the seeds and are spraying our foods with chemicals and destroying the soil. And if you really look at the studies, I mean, they're all funded by every pharmaceutical company under the book, right? Pfizer and Bayer and blah, blah, blah. So I feel like, they sort of profit every turn, and now they sort of have this narrative. I mean, if you look at the food guide, for instance, I like to call it the profit pyramid. The food pyramid. I call it the profit pyramid. You'll see, and I've actually seen this in my daughter's daycare. My daughter's 3 years old. And at the top of the food guide, you'll see bread and cereal and croissants and maybe some whole grain pasta, right? And I don't see how anyone could look at that with a serious face and say that this isn't completely corrupt. It's disgusting. And then you'll see meat at the bottom, because saturated fat's going to kill you. It's going to give you heart disease. It's going to give you cancer. Fat's going to make you fat. So is there any validity to these claims? Now, I know there have been a bunch of studies actually showing an inverse relationship where, with saturated fat. But is there any validity to these claims that saturated fat and cholesterol are harmful and they could give us heart disease or cancer or any of these other number of diseases that the pharmaceutical industry seems to want us to think that it does?
It doesn't hold any water at all. All of that is a big sieve, but
Yeah.
it just isn't true. One of the big problems with your body is free radical imbalance. So it's called redox balance, where you get too many free radicals and not enough power to produce your own glutathione, which is kind of what I was just describing with the liver when you're eating a lot of oxalate, where you get this imbalance where the body's having to use up all it can and produce all it can of these antioxidants and wear out. So one of the things that causes, free radical imbalance is rancid fats. The polyunsaturated and the unsaturated fats can go bad and be a big
this is like in bottled, obviously we've moved away from natural fat like tallow and
the saturated
lard,
one.
and we moved on to seed oils.
Unstable. They're very unstable versus stable. So the stable fats are the tallow and the butter and the highly saturated fats. And I was at Cornell, I was told that saturated fat will kill you. It causes cancer and heart disease and strokes, and it's just evil. And I came out of Cornell thinking, I'll never eat butter. I was afraid of butter for 20 something years because of my indoctrination in school, which makes no scientific fact. And I didn't really ever sit long enough with the pull between stuff my professors would just say, which is clearly just opinion, and bottom line conclusions with all the whole logical theorem that would lead to that belief is unclear. It's just, they don't ever go there and say how they get there, because you're just a student. So they'll just tell you how to think. And so they would say things like, sugar is benign, except for dental caries, and fat is going to kill you, and they're the cause of everything. And there's no science there. And people like Jane Brody came out with, the answer is, instead of eggs and meat, we should be doing low fat. So there was a huge low fat era. It was Fit or Fat, but Bailey, whatever. But I would say Jane Brody really heavily influenced me and made me believe that we should be eating quinoa and potatoes and starches. Potatoes are high in oxalate. Quinoa, I was taught to eat these kinds of foods and to do whole wheat berries and junk like this for breakfast and never let fat touch anything. And bought that and taught it to others and people I loved. And I convinced my mother, who thought eggs were fine and that you should have lots of protein so you don't get fat. And they're like, my parents' generation knew that carbs were dangerously fattening and low in nutrients. They knew that the nutrients were in the egg yolks and the meat, and we added the starches to stretch the food out so that you could feed a family and not have to buy a whole cow every time your 10 kids are starving. It's an easy way to stretch out a pound of meat. So everything became hamburger helper, more pasta on that, more rice on that, more potatoes on that. And that's actually the origin of a lot of this, was these sort of temperance movement nutrition types who were at the beginning of the founding of the agricultural / nutrition federal government stuff and the community nutrition stuff, came from people who had this moralistic idea that the immigrants shouldn't want all that meat and steak at every meal. They came here thinking in America you could have the life you want, which includes meat at every meal. And they try to convince them that was wrong and you should be living on cheap food, because their wages were terrible. And I think the attitude from the elites were their wages might as well be terrible. They just need learn how to live cheap. So again, it was always economics really, and sort of elitism and, other unpleasant isms that were promoting the very early dawn of nutrition science, of community-based nutrition, and our federal agricultural agencies trying to dictate what we should eat and tell us what we should eat. They're trying to sell us their products, and being told that, your belief that you get to have steak and that's the great American life. No, you should be eating succotash. And they sort of invented these Boston carby foods right from the dawn of nutrition 100 years ago. So we've just had it wrong from the minute we created professions in nutrition and public health. The agenda was economic, make the peanuts, make the South come back economically, and we'll create a food with peanuts and start making people eat peanut butter, which was never done before. And just, it comes from some ugly place, the wrong agenda. It was never about health right from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen, the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, there have been a lot of independent studies coming out showing that saturated fat is not detrimental to your health at all. In fact, there was an inverse relationship. But now it seems like there's a lot of studies coming out that, sort of blaming meat on the environmental crisis that we're in, which, obviously that's a huge rabbit hole. We could probably talk about that for 5 hours. We probably don't have a lot of time for that today, unfortunately. I'm hoping we could get into that at some point. But I wanted to touch base a little bit more on metabolic health, which you discussed earlier, and how potentially like anti-nutrients, and especially maybe oxalates, play a role in that. And you also mentioned in terms of repairing mitochondria. I was hoping to touch on that as well, and how perhaps insulin resistance might play a role in that. So could you tell us a little bit about how these anti-nutrients play a role in metabolic health?
Yeah, I wish there was more research that was really clear about it. A lot of the research I'm looking at talks about the connection between oxalate and insulin resistance and diabetes and obesity. And there's a two-way street there, because the more obese you are, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Before you continue, can you just maybe describe what insulin resistance is? Because I think a lot of people have a misconception of that.
Yeah, so when you're overloaded with glucose from a starchy meal, from sugary foods, your pancreas and your body's putting out a signal that tells the cells, get this sugar out of the bloodstream. This high sugar is bad for us. We don't want all the sugar here. Get it out. And the cells are it's almost like the emergency vehicles with their sirens. The insulin is screaming around going, get this out. And the cells are sort of going deaf. They can't hear it anymore. This emergency vehicle all over the body sound is driving them crazy, and they're worn out with it, basically. I mean, that's the way I think about insulin resistance, is that you can put out more sirens and ambulances and fire trucks and cops running around your vascular system with more insulin, and the cells are worn out. They're going deaf. It's been too much. It's wearing out the whole body. So insulin resistance is a big problem, because now you're going to have high blood sugar. It's, once your body can't absorb more of this constant load of carbohydrates, you're going to get high blood sugar, which is deadly. The whole process of having high insulin and high sugar is wrecking your vascular system and your brain and so on. So it's not good to nap.
Fat hormone, which also could lead to obesity and constant snacking and all these problems where we're constantly spiking our insulin, right?
Yeah, you get in this vicious cycle, because when the insulin is working and the cells do get rid of the sugar, they do it so well. And then your sugar load, your high carb diet, low fat, like your low fat carby breakfast, it just sort of runs out of steam. Like, it's so quick. It's a sudden peak of sugar in the bloodstream, and then there's nothing behind it. But if you had fat in the breakfast, it slows it down in the stomach. It takes it longer to digest in the small intestine, and you can slow this out. This is called like glycemic index. And white bread has higher glycemic index than sugar does, because straight up starch is pure glucose, and sugar is glucose and fructose is handled in a different way. It doesn't spike the sugar as much usually, but even fructose can be a problem. Like honey can be really spiky for some people. But so we've been told by Jane Brody and all the experts we should be living on fat-free wheat berries and quinoa and potatoes, and never let fat touch thy lips. And you can get really sick, not just from the low fat and the crazy blood sugar swings, and then you're eating all the time, and you're taking things like nuts and nuts with you and whatever, because you have to eat all the time, because your blood sugar is so up and down, which makes you feel like garbage. It wears you out and makes you old. But also these carby foods like potatoes and quinoa are high in oxalate. So you get a triple whammy of inflammation in the vascular system. And oxalate is interfering with the enzymes and also stressing out the mitochondria in ways and that wrecks the nucleus even of the cells and causes epigenetic changes. So I think it's through epigenetic changes where we get a chronic problem. We also get, longstanding metabolic difficulties. We have trouble keeping the blood sugar even on the low side. We're not now, because of oxalate interfering with enzymes, less able to add glucose back to the blood ourselves. So that makes you want to eat more carbs again. But normally you can make glucose in your body. You don't need to eat carbs at all. But if you're interfered with the enzymes and you've made these epidemic damages to the way the cells function, you're going to have trouble when your blood sugar goes low, just naturally correcting it yourself. And that I see that with my oxalate damaged people, that they do need carbs occasionally. They can't go on the full line diet or the full pure carnivore where they're eating no carbs all the time because they have trouble restoring their glycogen in their muscles and in their liver. So going on a nice low meat-based diet is good for healing the gut because there's no anti-nutrients there. There's no fiber. There's no crystals of oxalate. There's no oxalic acid. That sounds great. Yet if you have oxalic acid poisoning, you may still have some metabolic issues that are going to hang around. You may sometimes need carbs. I think that's why Paul Saladino promotes fruit and honey, because he's probably one of these ex-raw vegans who has damaged his metabolism. So it's going to be different for everyone. And how well you do on zero oxalate diet is a whole nother topic, because the lower your intake of oxalate, the more likely your body's going to purge these deposits that are hanging around in your joints, bones, and tissues. And that purging process increases oxalic acid levels in the bloodstream, increases the inflammation and symptoms, and increases the amount coming out in the kidneys. And so you either end up with kidney stones even after you quit eating. The main substance that a kidney stone is made of is on board. So you don't even need to eat it anymore. And you quit eating it, you more of it's passing through the kidneys and the bladder. So clearing up these bladder issues and kidney issues there sometimes takes a couple of years on a low oxalate diet, and clearing up your whole body's sort of toxicity problem can take 10 years. Thank God it does, because if you unloaded it all in 1 year, you wouldn't make it. It would probably cause you a heart attack.
Right.
And it would certainly clean out you'd be done with your kidneys. You'd be on dialysis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I personally, like with all my gut health issues, I've gone on the Lion diet. I've been on it for about 8 months now. And I feel like, I'm starting to finally turn a corner. However, I'm going through a lot of problems like oxalate dumping, which has been pretty horrendous some days, as you're well aware of. But I could tell you, just from my perspective, in terms of people who have done like a high ketogenic diet or a Lion diet or something like that, they're way more metabolically healthy. Like they're way more insulin sensitive. They're much able to manage their weight a lot better. And I've been able to manage my clients' weight much better going on a high ketogenic diet, a safe one. Now, I know studies have come out showing that kids with epilepsy are more likely to develop kidney stones on a ketogenic diet, but I'm assuming it's probably because they're on a plant-based keto or a high plant-based ketogenic diet, eating almonds and what a lot of other people do, right? So I know that we have to get going pretty soon. I just want to ask a couple more questions, if that's okay. So getting into oxalate dumping, could you tell us a little bit about that and how someone like myself, who's also struggling with oxalate dumping, how we can manage that, and what might be some foods we could eat to help manage oxalate dumping?
Yeah, this is a really big and important topic. So if you go on a Lion diet or a meat-based diet that's very low in oxalate, you don't feel so good on it, or you're getting the kidney stones and so on, that's probably a sign that you are clearing oxalate. And often the best way that works for most of my clients is actually add back in some oxalate to the diet and tell the body, the gut, the kidneys, the vascular system, hey, slow down on all this oxalate dumping. And I think what that's reflecting is the body actually is paying attention to things like oxalate. The body knows about oxalate. It even produces some oxalate every day as part of its metabolism. And as it's reading it, it's probably because we have a history of getting in the blackberry patch in the summer and maybe some potatoes in the fall and having oxalates even in our hunter-gatherer days. But then in the wintertime, you're on a big iceberg and you're fishing hole as a hole in the lake or the whatever, and you're hunting. And so during winter, you'd be on the lion diet every year. And that gives the body an opportunity to purge the summer oxalates. And it wasn't like what we're doing now. It certainly wasn't every day. You go through blackberries for 2 weeks and you're done. Mm-hmm. And that's not the case now, where we're getting that year round. So what you're now dealing with is winter. When you go on a lion diet, you've entered your first winter in 40 years.
Yeah.
So you got 40 years of oxalate. This is not just the old amount of oxalate, modern oxalate levels. 40 years of modern oxalate accumulation is probably the equivalent of 200 years of traditional oxalate accumulation. So if you've got 200 years of oxalate accumulation, and that should have been dealt with season by season. So you think of the lion diet as this winter time where the body's ready to purge, but we have to tell it no, it's not winter. You can't do this. And we can back it off. And see, it's not winter because we're going to have a cup of tea, 2 bag tea. We're going to have 5 spinach leaves, and we're going to have a 1/4 cup of sweet potato. And that will tell the body, it's a little fall, still fall, not really winter, and get it to slow down. And this often works really well for a lot of people. The only people I see it doesn't work for, there's 2 scenarios. One is where the immune system is so disturbed from all this gut damage, and this nanoparticles of oxalate forming all over the body creates a lot of autoimmune headaches, and a lot of autoimmune related diseases are from this oxalate poisoning. And you see these things start receding. But if you're to the point where you've got mast cell activation syndrome, your mast cells are so fragile and distressed and so busy trying to defend you that even a negative thought will make them go crazy. They respond even to emotional stress. In fact, emotional stress is the most common thing that's going to trip them off. And if you're afraid from all this health damage you had, all these kidney stones you've had, whatever, you're going to be in a mindset alone, let alone the whole body's like reading everything as an allergen, everything's becoming, you're intolerant to all this stuff. This kind of person has a harder time adding back oxalate because their mast cells are like, and I do think you have to do this very carefully, because once you're filling up your bloodstream and kidneys with oxalate from the deposits in your body's working at maximum capacity. And if you add in too much, like with a slice of chocolate keto cake for someone's birthday, or a pile of holiday foods loaded with sweet potatoes, etc., you're going to push yourself, your bloodstream and your kidneys at a toxic load by accidentally doing that. But we intentionally try to add sort of medical amounts to try to get the body to not clear as quickly. It's going to take you 8 or 10 years anyway. But if you're poisoning your system, you could end up in the emergency room with heart arrhythmias, your blood pressure and your pulse through the roof, and you feel like you're dying of a heart attack. And that's the electrolyte loss so heavily that the pacemaker and all these regulatory systems, the kidney, they're all stressing out. And literally people, while dumping, end up in the emergency room with cardiac emergencies.
Wow. Okay. So getting into testing, how does one go about testing for oxalates, and are there any useful tests for oxalates? I know myself, I've done an OAT, which is an organic acids test, and it showed that I didn't have an oxalate problem, even though I've had dozens and dozens of oxalate kidney stones in my life. And obviously I have problems with oxalates. So can you just discuss that a little bit as well?
Yeah, so the OAT is a urine test. It's a spot urine test where you take one sample in the morning, I believe, and they're looking for oxalate in the urine and other metabolic acids, which gives us some clue about oxalate metabolism. And I too had an OAT test in 2009 that showed I had no oxalate problem. And you
Right.
and I both are really sick with oxalates.
Yeah.
And the test doesn't show it. And so it's very easy to get a false negative, but if you get an OATs or other kind of urine test that shows high oxalate, believe that. That's true. What's not true is that low means you don't have a problem, because how much oxalate the kidneys can release or are being asked to release by the rest of the body varies moment to moment. The urine is a snapshot, and there's a lot of management going around in the background where we're not constantly dosing the kidneys with oxalate, and there's little rest periods and so on that the body creates in order for tissue survival. I think that's my theory about it. But we know from the research, one study in particular said it takes 9 tests of the urine to estimate average oxalate levels, as if there was an average. I mean, is an average meaningful when it go from low to skyrocketing high and up and down? It's not meaningful. What's meaningful is, do you catch it high? But if you don't catch it high, that's not telling you anything. Partially because if your kidneys are stressed, they're not even able to release oxalate anymore. And so the more kidney damage caused by oxalate, the less likely you are to find oxalate in the urine.
Okay. So Sally, just to wrap things up, I guess we're running a little bit late here. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your book and where we could find you on social media. Before I let you go, I also have to say, for my fitness people out there, if you look up Sally on Instagram, Sally is ripped. So I don't know what your secret is, Sally, but you're doing a good job, whatever you're doing. But if you could just share a little bit of information as to where we can find you in your book, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I'm 57 going on 58, old dame, but it's still okay if you see like my arms, because I have been a health geek most of my life, and that's paid off. And to deal with my feet, I had to swim a lot, and probably so people talk about my guns. I don't know why I have I don't know why I have muscle definition and no fat under my skin, but I wish
you have abs of steel. I've seen your abs.
They've been like that for, like I work in a computer, and I could have been probably a bodybuilder and would have loved to do that if I wasn't sick with oxalate all the time and knew how to make a calf pop. I don't have any calves, but some of that is just because I have been a health geek, and I've been willing to eat meat and protein now for a very long time. And protein, I now gorge on protein because I eat a meat-based diet. That hasn't really changed my look. I mean, it's because I've not been eating garbage.
Yeah.
So that's the one good thing, that oxalate doesn't destroy everything. Yeah, my book is called Oxalate Overload, and it's trying to reach a broad audience. So it's tried to simplify things. I've tried to sneak in as much science as I can for a general book and for a book coming out of a mainstream publishing house. So it's considered a medical nutrition book because it does have science in it, not as much as I'd like to really show you what's going on, but it's hopefully going to help a lot of people. It has a lot of, testimonials and stories, because that's really where the wisdom comes from, real life. And then you go to the philosophical and abstract world of science, and science only makes sense in the context of real life. So there's a lot of real life stories. And then we go to the science to say, what happened to this person? Why does a low oxalate diet send you to the hospital with arrhythmias and a heart emergency? Or why does a low oxalate diet allow you to still get kidney stones? In science, they say it's because a low oxalate diet doesn't work. Wrong conclusion. But if you take it in the context of our actual human experiences, then you understand that they're missing the boat on this whole accumulation problem. So find me on Instagram, which is SK Norton. And my website is sallyknorton.com. There's lots of free information there. You can sign up for my groups where you can learn about the supplements that support dealing with the acidity, dealing with the metabolic problems, and the loss of nutrients that we have from the oxalate clearing, as well as the oxalate eating, both sides. You keep losing potassium, you need the calcium, and so on. So a lot of people do much better when they get on the lion diet or get off oxalates if they're adding in calcium, magnesium, potassium, certain kinds of B vitamins, understanding how to manage the clearing, how to use mineral baths. And so if you think you're remotely sick with oxalates, coming to my website and maybe one of my groups might really support you in that.
Okay, perfect. So if you guys want, you can find me. I'm going to link Sally's information in the description. And if you guys want to check out my business as well, or link that as well. And you guys could also do consultations with me. Sally, there's so many rabbit holes I feel like we could go down. I'm really hoping we could do a part two. There's so many things that are sort of popping up in my head right now that I feel like we could discuss regarding oxalates and the environment and metabolic health and all these other things that we talked about today. But I just want to thank you so much for coming and speaking with me today. I'm a huge fan of yours, huge fan of your work, and I think you're doing a lot of good work out there. So I appreciate you coming on talking to me today.
Thank you for your interest in helping others. Appreciate it so much. It's great to connect with you.
Thank you, Sally.